The bright studio lights cast their warm glow across the familiar late-night talk show set. Tonight was going to be special. Two of Hollywood's biggest names were sitting side by side on the plush burgundy couch, and the audience could feel the energy in the air. Will Smith sat with his usual confident posture, one arm stretched casually along the back of the couch. His megawatt smile was in full display as he chatted with the production crew during the commercial break. He looked every bit the superstar he had been for decades. Sharp black suit, perfectly styled, and that natural charisma that had made him a household name since his Fresh Prince days. Next to him sat Keanu Reeves, a stark contrast in every way. Where Will was animated and loud, Keanu was quiet and thoughtful. He wore a simple dark blazer over a black shirt, his long hair slightly tousled in that effortless way that had become his signature look. While Will joked with the crew, Keanu sat calmly, occasionally nodding politely at the conversations around him. The show's host, a veteran of late-night television, shuffled through his note cards one final time. He had interviewed thousands of celebrities over his career, but having these two particular stars on the same night felt like something special. Both were promoting new movies, and their publicists had thought it would be great television to have them appear together. In the audience, 300 people sat in anticipation. Many had waited months to get tickets to this taping. They held their phones ready, hoping to catch a memorable moment they could share with friends later. The energy was electric, the kind that only comes when genuine A-list talent fills a room. 30 seconds, called out the floor manager. Will straightened his tie and flashed that famous grin toward the cameras. Keanu simply sat up a little straighter, his hands resting calmly in his lap. The difference between them was striking. Will seemed to feed off the energy of the crowd, while Keanu appeared content to simply observe and take it all in. The show's theme music began to play, and the host walked out to thunderous applause. After his opening monologue, which included the usual mix of current events and celebrity gossip, he turned his attention to his guests. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome two of Hollywood's finest, Will Smith and Keanu Reeves." The audience erupted as both men walked out. Will bounded across the stage with his characteristic swagger, waving to different sections of the crowd and pointing to people he seemed to recognize. Keanu followed at his own pace, offering a modest wave and a genuine smile to the cheering fans. As they settled into their seats, the host began with the standard questions. "So gentlemen, you're both here promoting new films. Will, let's start with you." Will launched into his usual entertaining promotional mode. He told funny stories from the set, did impressions of his co-stars, and had the audience laughing within minutes. This was his element, performing, entertaining, being the center of attention. He was a natural showman, and it showed in every gesture and expression. When it was Keanu's turn, the contrast was immediately apparent. He spoke thoughtfully about his new project, choosing his words carefully. He thanked his director and co-stars genuinely, without the exaggerated Hollywood speak that often fills these interviews. Where Will was performance, Keanu was authenticity. "You know what I find interesting," Will said, turning slightly toward Keanu during a natural pause in the conversation, "is how different we approach this whole celebrity thing." The audience chuckled, sensing this might lead somewhere entertaining. The host leaned forward, always ready for good television. "What do you mean by that?" Keanu asked, his voice calm and curious. "Well," Will continued, his tone still light and seemingly friendly, "you've got this whole mysterious quiet guy thing going on. Very philosophical, very deep." He said the last word with just a hint of something that could have been teasing, though it was subtle enough that most people in the audience probably missed it. Keanu smiled politely. "I just try to be myself, you know." Right. Will nodded, but there was something in his expression that suggested he wasn't quite done with this line of conversation. "And that works for you. The whole man of few words thing. Very mysterious, very calculated." The word calculated hung in the air for just a moment too long. The host glanced between them, his experienced instincts telling him this might be heading somewhere interesting, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was happening yet. "I don't really think about it that way," Keanu replied simply. "I just try to be honest in interviews. Talk about the work. You know how it is." "Oh, I do know how it is," Will said, his smile never wavering but something shifting almost imperceptibly in his tone. "I've been doing this for a long time. And what I've learned is that sometimes the most authentic thing you can do is actually be entertaining. Give people what they came for. Not everyone needs to be so—" He paused as if searching for the right word. "Serious all the time." A few people in the audience laughed, though it was unclear whether they were laughing with Will or just responding to the slight tension they could sense building. Keanu nodded thoughtfully. Everyone has their own way of doing things. That's what makes it interesting, right? The host, sensing a good moment for television but also wanting to keep things friendly, jumped in. "Well, you both certainly have your own styles, and they've both worked incredibly well for you. Will, your new movie is already breaking box office records. And Keanu, the critics are calling your performance one of your best yet." "See? Now that's what I'm talking about," Will said, turning back to the host but gesturing toward Keanu. "Look at how he handles compliments. So humble, so modest. It's like he doesn't want to take credit for anything good that happens to him." This time the comment landed differently. A few people in the audience shifted uncomfortably, though most were still trying to figure out if this was playful banter or something else. Keanu remained calm, his expression unchanged. "I think good work speaks for itself. And filmmaking is collaborative. It's never just about one person." "Right, collaborative," Will repeated, nodding as if he was considering this deeply. "That's very diplomatic of you." The host was starting to look slightly concerned, his years of experience telling him that the dynamic between his guests was shifting, in a way that might not be entirely comfortable for everyone involved. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Will making seemingly innocent comments that carried just enough edge to create an undercurrent of tension. Each remark was delivered with his trademark smile and charisma, making it difficult for anyone to definitively say he was being anything other than playful. But in the studio that night, something was building, and everyone present, from the audience members to the crew to Keanu himself, could feel it, even if they couldn't quite name what it was yet. After the commercial break, the atmosphere in the studio felt different. Something had shifted during those few minutes of conversation before the ads, and everyone could sense it. The audience members were sitting a little more forward in their seats. The camera operators had subtly adjusted their positions. Even the host seemed more alert, like someone who had just realized they might be witnessing something unexpected. Will Smith returned from the break with the same bright smile, but there was an energy about him now that hadn't been there before. He seemed more focused on Keanu, more interested in drawing him into conversation. It wasn't obvious to most people watching, but it was there, a hunter's instinct that had locked on to something. "You know what I was thinking about during the break?" Will said as the show came back live. He didn't wait for anyone to ask what he'd been thinking about. "I was thinking about how different our careers have been. Really different paths, you know?" Keanu nodded politely. "Everyone's journey is unique." "Exactly," Will said, slapping his knee as if Keanu had made some profound point. "That's exactly what I mean. Like I've always been about connecting with people, you know? Making them laugh, making them feel something. Entertainment, that's what this business is about, right?" The host tried to interject with a question about their upcoming projects, but Will was on a roll now. "But then you've got this whole other approach," he continued, gesturing toward Keanu. "Very internal, very— what's the word? Introspective? Is that fair to say?" "I suppose," Keanu replied carefully. "And that works for you? I mean, look at your success. People love the whole mysterious thing. The guy who doesn't say much, but when he does, it's supposed to be really meaningful." Will's tone was still light, still playful, but there was something underneath it now that was harder to ignore. A few people in the audience exchanged glances. This felt like it was going somewhere specific, though none of them could predict where. "I just try to be thoughtful about what I say," Keanu said simply. "Thoughtful?" "Right. Very thoughtful." Will nodded, as if he was really considering this. "And you know what? That's smart. Because when you don't say much, people fill in the blanks themselves. They project whatever they want onto you. It's like you become this blank canvas that everyone can paint their own version of wisdom on." The comment hung in the air for a moment. It was clever, cutting, but delivered with such charm that it was hard to immediately identify it as an attack. Keanu's expression remained calm. "I think people appreciate authenticity, whatever form it takes." "Authenticity," Will repeated as if tasting the word. "That's interesting, because I've been thinking about that lately. What is authentic when you're in the public eye? Is it more authentic to be yourself, flaws and all, loud and messy and human? Or is it more authentic to present this carefully crafted version of yourself that never seems to get ruffled, never seems to have bad days? The host was starting to look genuinely uncomfortable now. This wasn't the light celebrity banter his show was known for. I think everyone has bad days, Keanu said quietly. Some people just handle them differently. Oh, absolutely, Will agreed quickly. Everyone has struggles. Everyone has problems. The question is, do you share them with people? Do you let them see that you're human? Or do you keep it all locked away and let people think you're some kind of Zen master who's figured it all out? Several audience members were now clearly uncomfortable. What had started as possibly playful ribbing was beginning to feel like something else entirely. I don't think I've ever claimed to have anything figured out, Keanu replied, still maintaining his calm demeanor. No, of course not, Will said, waving his hand as if to dismiss any suggestion that he was being critical. You're way too smart for that. Too calculated. You'd never make that mistake. There was that word again, calculated. But this time it landed differently. This time it felt deliberate, pointed. The host finally managed to jump in. Well, I think both of your approaches have clearly worked incredibly well. Let's talk about your new films. You know what I really admire about Keanu, Will interrupted, turning to face the host but continuing to talk about Keanu as if he wasn't sitting right there, is how he's managed to turn personal tragedy into this whole brand of deep, meaningful artistry. The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operators stopped moving. Everyone knew that Will had just crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. Keanu's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, just for a moment, before settling back into that same calm composure. I mean, think about it, Will continued, seemingly oblivious to the horrified silence around him. Most people go through loss and they fall apart. They get messy. They get ugly. They get real. But not our guy here. He takes all that pain and somehow transforms it into this mystical, philosophical thing that makes people think he's got some special connection to the universe. The host was staring at Will in obvious shock. Several audience members had their hands over their mouths. This had gone from uncomfortable to genuinely appalling in the span of seconds. Will, the host finally managed to say, his voice strained. But Will wasn't done. And the money thing, he said as if he'd just remembered something delightful. Oh, the money thing is brilliant. Giving away millions to charity, living modestly, taking the subway. It's genius marketing, really. Because it makes everyone else in Hollywood look greedy and out of touch by comparison. He was talking faster now, his energy building as if he was feeding off the shocked silence around him. I mean, we're all trying to make a living here, right? We work hard, we earn money, we spend it. But when you've got someone who makes this big show of giving it all away, suddenly the rest of us look bad for wanting to enjoy the fruits of our labor. It's passive-aggressive genius, really. Keanu sat perfectly still through all of this. His hands remained folded in his lap. His breathing remained steady, but everyone in that studio could feel the weight of what was happening, this public humiliation of a man who had never done anything to deserve it. And the best part, Will continued, now fully committed to this destructive path, is that you can't even call him out on it because then you look like the bad guy. Because who attacks the humble, generous, philosophical guy, right? Who questions the motives of the man who gives away his money and rides the subway and never says a bad word about anyone? The silence in the studio was now complete and suffocating. 300 people sat in stunned disbelief, watching one beloved celebrity systematically tear down another for no apparent reason. The host looked like he wanted to crawl under his desk. The production crew was frantically trying to figure out if they should cut to commercial. And through it all, Keanu Reeves sat quietly, absorbing every cruel word without defending himself, without fighting back, without giving Will Smith the reaction he seemed to be trying to provoke. But something was building in that silence. Something was coming. And everyone in that room could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon. The silence in the studio had become unbearable. It was the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, that makes you suddenly aware of every small sound, the hum of the air conditioning, the soft shuffle of someone shifting uncomfortably in their seat, the distant sound of traffic outside the building. Will Smith sat back in his chair, looking satisfied with himself in a way that made everyone watching feel sick to their stomachs. He had the expression of someone who had just won an argument, though nobody else in the room could understand what victory he thought he had achieved. His famous smile was still there, but it looked different now, colder, more calculated than the warm, infectious grin that had made him America's sweetheart decades ago. The host stared down at his note cards as if they might contain some magical words that could fix what had just happened. His hands were actually shaking slightly. In 30 years of television, he had never experienced anything quite like this. He had seen celebrity feuds, awkward interviews, and uncomfortable moments, but nothing that felt quite so deliberately cruel, so personally destructive. Camera operators stood frozen behind their equipment, unsure whether they should keep rolling or cut away. The director in the booth was probably having a panic attack, trying to decide if this was the kind of television that would make careers or destroy them. Everyone knew they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years, but nobody was sure if that was a good thing or a terrible thing. In the audience, people sat in stunned silence. Many had their phones out, recording everything, but their faces showed they weren't quite sure what they were capturing. Was this some kind of elaborate setup? Were they watching a friendship implode in real time? Was this just Hollywood ego run amok? The confusion was written across hundreds of faces, but through it all, Keanu Reeves sat perfectly still. He hadn't moved during Will's entire tirade. His breathing remained steady, his hands stayed folded in his lap, his expression remained calm and thoughtful. But if you looked closely, really looked, you could see something in his eyes. Not anger, not hurt, but something deeper. Something that suggested he was processing everything he had just heard, considering it, weighing it against everything he knew about human nature and pain and the ways people hurt each other. Will seemed to sense that his moment was passing. The silence was starting to shift from shocked paralysis to something else, a kind of anticipation that he might not be able to control. He glanced around the studio, taking in the horrified faces, the uncomfortable body language, the sense that maybe his performance hadn't landed quite the way he had intended. "Look," he said finally, his voice cutting through the quiet like a blade. "I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking but is too polite to say out loud." That comment seemed to snap something in the room. Several audience members actually gasped audibly. The host looked up from his cards with an expression of pure disbelief. "Everyone's got this image of the perfect, enlightened, generous movie star," Will continued, either oblivious to or energized by the growing horror around him. "But come on, nobody's that good. Nobody gives away that much money without wanting something in return. Nobody stays that calm and zen and philosophical without it being an act." He leaned forward slightly, as if sharing a secret with the audience. "And the tragedy thing, I mean, we all feel bad about what happened to him. Of course we do. Loss is terrible. But at some point, you've got to wonder if someone's using their pain as a way to make themselves seem deeper, more meaningful than the rest of us regular people who just go through life without turning every hardship into some kind of spiritual journey." The words hit the studio like physical blows. Several people in the audience were now visibly upset. Some were shaking their heads in disgust. Others looked like they wanted to leave but felt frozen in their seats, unable to look away from the disaster unfolding in front of them. The host finally found his voice. "Will, I think maybe we should—" No, let me finish," Will said, holding up a hand. "Because this is important. This is about authenticity, right? About being real with people instead of hiding behind some carefully constructed image." He turned to look directly at Keanu for the first time since his attack had begun. "So here's my question for you. Keanu, just between friends, just being honest here on live television, how much of this whole thing is real? And how much of it is just the most successful marketing campaign in Hollywood history? The humble, generous, wise, wounded artist who never has a bad word to say about anyone. How much of that is actually you? And how much of it is just really, really good publicity?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. Everyone in the room felt contaminated by it, ashamed to have heard it, angry to have witnessed such a deliberate attempt to destroy someone's character on live television. And still, Keanu Reeves sat quietly. His eyes had closed briefly while Will was speaking, as if he was centering himself, preparing for something. When he opened them again, there was something different there. Not anger, not defensiveness, but a kind of clarity that hadn't been there before. The silence stretched on. Will was clearly expecting some kind of response, maybe anger, maybe hurt, maybe defensiveness that he could then attack further. But Keanu just sat there looking at him with an expression that was impossible to read. "Well?" Will prompted after the quiet had gone on longer than anyone expected. "Nothing to say? No wise words? No philosophical insights about how we should all be more understanding of each other?" His tone was mocking now, openly contemptuous in a way that made everyone watching feel embarrassed for him rather than entertained by him. The host tried one more time to intervene. "Maybe we should take a break and—" "No," Keanu said quietly. It was the first word he had spoken since Will's attack began, and it stopped everyone in the room cold. His voice was calm, steady, but there was something in it that commanded attention in a way that shouting never could. "No," he said again, slightly louder this time. "I think we should talk about this." Will's expression shifted slightly. For the first time since his tirade began, he looked uncertain, as if maybe this wasn't going exactly as he had planned. Keanu turned in his chair to face Will directly. The movement was slow, deliberate, and somehow it felt like the most important thing that had happened in that studio all night. "You want to talk about authenticity," Keanu said, his voice still quiet but now carrying to every corner of the room. "About what's real and what's not. About pain and how people handle it. About generosity and whether it comes from genuine places or calculated ones." Will nodded, though his confidence seemed to be wavering. "Okay," Keanu said simply. "Let's talk about that." And in that moment, everyone in the studio, the 300 audience members, the host, the crew, the millions of people who would eventually see this clip, understood that something important was about to happen. Something that would change how they thought about celebrity, about human nature, about the difference between performance and truth. The turning point had arrived. When Keanu began to speak, something extraordinary happened in that television studio. The oppressive silence that had been building for the past several minutes transformed into something else entirely. A kind of focused attention that felt almost sacred. 300 people, dozens of crew members, and millions of viewers would later remember this as one of those rare moments when time seemed to slow down, when every word carried weight beyond its simple meaning. "You know, Will," Keanu began, his voice carrying that same quiet intensity that had stopped the conversation cold. "I've been sitting here listening to everything you've said, and I keep thinking about something my friend River used to tell me. The mention of River Phoenix, the young actor who had died tragically decades earlier, someone everyone knew had been one of Keanu's closest friends, sent a ripple through the studio. This wasn't going to be what anyone expected. He used to say that the hardest thing about being in this business wasn't the rejection or the criticism or even the success. It was figuring out who you really were when everyone around you was telling you who you should be." Keanu's eyes were focused on Will, but his expression wasn't angry or defensive. Instead, there was something almost gentle about it, as if he was looking at someone he genuinely wanted to understand. "You asked me about authenticity, about what's real and what's performance. And I think that's actually a beautiful question because it's one that everyone in this room has probably wrestled with at some point. When you're in the public eye, when people are watching your every move, when your mistakes get magnified and your good deeds get questioned, it becomes really easy to lose track of why you're doing anything at all." The studio was so quiet that you could hear people breathing. Even the crew members had stopped moving around, completely absorbed in what was happening. "You mentioned my generosity and you suggested that maybe it's calculated. Maybe it's marketing. And you know what? I can understand why someone might think that. Because in a world where everything gets turned into a brand, where every action gets analyzed and dissected and assigned motives, it's natural to become suspicious of anything that looks too good to be true." Will shifted uncomfortably in his chair. This wasn't the defensive response he had been trying to provoke, and he seemed unsure how to handle the direction the conversation was taking. But here's the thing about generosity, about kindness, about trying to do right by people. And I think you know this. Deep down, it's not something you do for other people to see. It's not something you do to build an image or create a brand. You do it because when you've experienced real loss, real pain, real darkness in your life, you understand how precious it is when someone shows up for you with no agenda except to help. Keanu paused, and in that pause, several people in the audience wiped away tears they didn't even realize had started falling. "You talked about my personal tragedies, and how maybe I've used them to create some kind of mystical persona. And I want to be really honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty, and I think everyone listening deserves honesty." He took a breath, and when he continued, his voice was even steadier than before. When someone you love dies unexpectedly, when you lose a child, when life hits you with the kind of pain that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world, you have choices. You can let it make you bitter. You can let it make you angry. You can use it as an excuse to hurt other people because you're hurting. Or you can try to let it teach you something about how fragile and precious and brief this whole experience really is. The host sat transfixed, his note cards forgotten. This had become something far beyond what anyone had planned for television that night. I didn't choose to go through those experiences. Nobody would choose that. But I did get to choose what to do with them afterward. And what I learned is that when you've really faced loss, when you've really stared into that darkness, it becomes impossible to take the small stuff seriously. It becomes impossible to get worked up about Hollywood politics or box office numbers or who said what about whom in some interview. Keanu turned slightly to address the audience directly, though his words were clearly still meant for Will. And the money thing, you're right to question it. You should question it. Because in a world where people are struggling to pay rent and buy food, it should seem strange when someone gives away millions of dollars. But here's what I learned about money after I started making it. It's just a tool. It's just a way to do things. And if you have more than you need, if you have more than you can possibly use in several lifetimes, then keeping it becomes about something other than taking care of yourself. It becomes about something else entirely. He looked back at Will directly. You asked how much of who I am is real and how much is marketing, and I think that's actually a question you might want to ask yourself. Because the Will Smith I used to know, the one I met years ago at industry events, the one who was kind to young actors and generous with his time and genuinely funny without needing to tear other people down to get laughs, that person was real. That person was authentic. And I have to wonder what happened to him. The words landed like a gentle but devastating blow. Will's confident expression had completely disappeared, replaced by something that looked like confusion and maybe the beginning of shame. I think sometimes, when we've been performing for so long, when we've been on for so many years, we can start to confuse the performance with who we really are. We can start to believe that being entertaining means being cruel, that being funny means making other people feel small, that being successful means proving that other people are fake or calculated or less than us. Keanu's voice remained gentle throughout this, never rising, never becoming accusatory. Instead, it carried the weight of someone who had clearly thought deeply about these questions, who had wrestled with them in his own life. But that's not who you are, Will. At least it's not who you were, and it doesn't have to be who you become. The studio remained in absolute silence. People in the audience were crying openly now, moved by something they couldn't quite name but knew they were privileged to witness. You want to talk about authenticity? Here's what authentic looks like. It's admitting when you're struggling. It's acknowledging when you're in pain instead of trying to inflict that pain on other people. It's recognizing that every person in this room, every person watching at home, every person in this industry that we're all so lucky to be part of, is fighting battles that nobody else can see. He paused again, and when he continued, his voice carried something that sounded almost like compassion. And it's understanding that tearing other people down will never, ever make you feel better about yourself. It will never fill whatever emptiness you're trying to fill. It will never solve whatever problem you're trying to solve. All it does is spread the pain around, make more people hurt the way you're hurting. The silence that followed these words was different from all the silences that had come before. This wasn't the stunned quiet of people witnessing something terrible. This was the profound silence of people who had just heard something true. Something important, something that would stay with them long after they left that studio. The silence that followed Keanu's words seemed to stretch on forever. It was the kind of quiet that reaches into your chest and makes you hold your breath, the kind that makes you aware of your own heartbeat, your own mortality, your own capacity for both cruelty and kindness. In that television studio, 300 people sat as still as statues, afraid that even the smallest movement might break whatever spell had been cast over the room. Will Smith, for the first time in decades of public appearances, looked completely lost. The confident smile that had been his trademark since the 1990s was gone entirely. His shoulders had slumped forward and he was staring down at his hands as if he had never seen them before. The transformation was startling. In the space of a few minutes, he had gone from the commanding presence who had dominated the first half of the interview to someone who looked smaller, younger, more vulnerable than anyone had seen him in years. The host sat frozen behind his desk, his note cards scattered and forgotten. His years of experience had taught him how to handle awkward moments, uncomfortable silences, even celebrity meltdowns. But this was something entirely different. This wasn't a moment that could be smoothed over with a joke or redirected with a clever question. This was a moment that demanded to be felt, to be absorbed, to be given the respect and weight it deserved. Camera operators stood motionless behind their equipment, unsure whether they should keep rolling or look away. The director in the booth had stopped giving instructions entirely. Everyone understood, without anyone saying it out loud, that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a moment of genuine human truth in a world that had become increasingly artificial, but it was in the audience where the real impact of Keanu's words was most visible. People who had come expecting light entertainment, celebrity gossip, and promotional interviews were wiping away tears they hadn't expected to shed. Some sat with their hands pressed to their hearts. Others had their eyes closed as if they were processing something too profound for visual input. Many were recording on their phones, but their expressions showed they understood they were capturing something far more significant than a typical celebrity appearance. An elderly woman in the third row was crying openly, her tissues forgotten in her lap. Next to her, a young man who had probably come hoping to see Will Smith crack jokes was staring at the stage with an expression of wonder. Behind them, a middle-aged couple held hands tightly, as if Keanu's words had reminded them of something important about their own relationship, their own capacity for kindness or cruelty toward each other. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 30 seconds, Will looked up from his hands. When he did, his eyes were red-rimmed and his voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper. He began, then stopped. He swallowed hard and tried again. I don't know why I said those things. The admission hung in the air like a prayer. It was the first completely honest thing he had said all evening, and everyone in the room could feel the truth of it. I came here tonight thinking, I don't know what I was thinking. That I needed to prove something, maybe. That I needed to. He shook his head, unable to finish the thought. Keanu watched him with the same gentle attention he had shown throughout his own response, giving Will the space to work through whatever was happening in his mind. You're right, Will continued, his voice still quiet but growing stronger. About all of it. About who I used to be. About what I've become. About the pain and the performance. He looked directly at Keanu for the first time since the attack had begun. I'm sorry, he said simply. I'm really truly sorry. Not just for what I said tonight, but for whoever I've been lately. For whatever made me think that hurting someone else would make me feel better about myself. The apology was met with another profound silence. But this time it felt different. This time it felt like healing. Keanu reached over and placed a hand on Will's shoulder. A simple gesture that somehow contained years of understanding, forgiveness, and genuine compassion. We all lose our way sometimes, Keanu said quietly. The important thing is finding your way back. The host, finally sensing that the moment was ready for his input, leaned forward slightly. I think, he said carefully, this might be the most honest conversation we've ever had on this show. A few people in the audience nodded in agreement. Someone started to applaud, just a slow, steady clapping that others gradually joined. But it wasn't the kind of applause you hear at the end of entertainment. It was the kind you hear at the end of something sacred, something that has changed everyone who witnessed it. When the show finally went to its last commercial break, neither Will nor Keanu moved from their seats. They sat together in quiet conversation, too low for the audience to hear, while people around them tried to process what they had just experienced. In the days that followed, clips of the exchange would spread across social media faster than anyone could have predicted. But these weren't the usual viral moments, the kind that get shared for shock value or entertainment. These were shared by people who felt compelled to pass along something meaningful, something that had moved them, something that reminded them of their own capacity for both darkness and light. The comment sections, usually filled with jokes and criticism and meaningless chatter, were different too. People shared their own stories of loss and redemption. They talked about times they had hurt others when they were hurting themselves. They reflected on the difference between authentic vulnerability and performed emotion. Mental health organizations reported an increase in people seeking help in the weeks following the broadcast. Charitable organizations saw unexpected donations from people who said they had been inspired by the conversation about generosity and purpose. Will Smith, who had built a career on being larger than life, found himself in the strange position of being more beloved for showing his smallness, his humanness, his capacity for growth and change. His next public appearances were marked by a humility and genuineness that reminded people why they had fallen in love with him in the first place. And Keanu Reeves, who had already been regarded as one of Hollywood's most decent people, became something else entirely, not just a good person but a wise one. Someone who understood that true strength isn't about never falling down, but about how you help others get back up. But perhaps the most significant change was in the audience members who had been there that night. They left the studio different than they had entered it. They carried with them the memory of a moment when someone chose compassion over cruelty, understanding over judgment, healing over harm. In a world that often feels divided, angry, and quick to tear down rather than build up, they had witnessed something rare and precious: the possibility of redemption, the power of forgiveness, and the profound impact that one person's choice to respond with grace can have on everyone around them. It was, many would say later, the most important television they had ever seen, not because it was entertaining, but because it was true. And in that truth, they found something they didn't even know they had been looking for: hope.